Hey guys, tonight, we're slipping back into the gaslit streets of Victorian England, where horse hooves clop against cobblestones slick with rain, and the air smells faintly of coal smoke and damp wool. You can almost hear the slow rustle of parasols and the crisp click of polished boots, until suddenly someone makes a fatal social error. They open an umbrella indoors. Yes, believe it or not, in this world, that's not just bad luck, it's practically a declaration of war. You probably won't survive this. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And I'd love to know, where are you listening from? And what time is it for you right now? Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You step into a friend's lavish drawing room on a rainy afternoon, raindrops still clinging to your overcoat. Your fingers itch to snap open your umbrella so it can dry, but here in Victorian England, that would be a shocking breach of etiquette. The superstition that it's bad luck is only half the story. The real reason is that opening an umbrella indoors was considered uncouth and even dangerous in tight, fragile spaces. Imagine a room crowded with delicate porcelain vases, oil lamps, and potted palms. One careless twist and you've knocked over something worth more than your yearly income. Victorians prided themselves on order and control, and the umbrella rule was a kind of social filter. If you didn't know better, you revealed yourself as an outsider, someone without proper upbringing, or heaven forbid, taste. Historians still argue whether this came from genuine superstition, or if it was just an excuse for the upper classes to spot the wrong sort instantly. Of course, there was also a streak of genuine fear behind it. These umbrellas were not the light, collapsible little things you toss in your tote bag today. Many were made with long steel spokes and sharp ferrules, some even doubling as walking sticks. Picture someone swinging open a 5-pound metal-spined contraption near Aunt Margaret's prized tea service. Yes, injuries happened. And if you're wondering, no insurance claims weren't exactly common. One quirky tidbit: some etiquette guides advise drying your umbrella only in a discreet corner handle, down canopy furled tight. And in certain households, a servant's sole rainy day task was to greet you at the door and whisk your umbrella away before you could commit the unthinkable. It's like a valet service, but for preventing social suicide. You walk deeper into the parlor, and the umbrella itch gets worse. Your coat is wet, your hands are cold, and you can practically feel the mildew creeping in. But the hostess, her gloved hands folded just so, casts a glance that freezes you mid-motion. There's a silent duel here. Will you endure the slow drip of discomfort, or risk your reputation to save your umbrella's ribs? You sit down, legs together, because sprawling would be another faux pas, and lean your damp shield carefully against the wall, hoping no one notices the puddle slowly forming on the Turkish rug. It's easy to laugh at the rule now, but think about the wider system it sat inside. Victorian etiquette wasn't just about manners, it was a performance of identity, a constant display of your place in the social order. Every action in a room full of company was loaded with meaning, and something as small as opening an umbrella indoors could mark you as careless, uneducated, or common. And in the most absurd twist, there were urban legends that umbrella violations brought literal misfortune. Newspapers occasionally printed tales, half gossip, half ghost story, about people who had accidents, illnesses, or sudden financial ruin shortly after breaking the rule. Did Victorians really believe it? Some did. But for most, it was probably like saying, "Bless you" after a sneeze, a polite reflex dressed up as tradition. You decide to play it safe, keeping the umbrella closed until you leave. Yet the moment you step back into the rain, you realize your fingers are numb, your coat soaked through, and your umbrella now smells faintly of the parlor's floral potpourri, a scent you'll carry for the rest of the day. Still, you walk away with your social standing intact, which in Victorian England is worth far more than feeling your toes. You've made it through the umbrella ordeal with your dignity intact. But the Victorian world isn't done testing you. Now you're standing on the polished front steps of another grand townhouse, clutching something that looks harmless, a small, stiff rectangle of cream-colored cardstock. It's your calling card, your passport into the labyrinth of social interaction. Without it, you might as well be invisible. In Victorian England, calling cards weren't just polite. They were mandatory for anyone hoping to navigate the intricate web of friendships, courtships, and alliances. They were engraved with your name in elegant script, sometimes with extra flourishes like embossed edges or gilt lettering if you were feeling fancy. And here's the strange part. The card didn't just announce who you were. The way you presented it, the timing of your delivery, and even the angle at which it sat in the silver tray in the entry hall, all carried specific meanings. You approach the door, heart thumping, like you're about to hand in a final exam. A liveried servant opens it just enough to take your card. No, you're not allowed to just waltz in. The servant disappears into the shadows, and now you wait. Will your hostess be at home or not at home? That phrase sounds simple, but here's the kicker. Not at home could mean she's genuinely away. Or it could be the polite equivalent of, "We don't want to see you today." Historians still argue whether the system was designed more for convenience or for the sheer power trip of turning people away without an awkward conversation. One mainstream fact is that this entire calling card ritual was codified in etiquette manuals which read more like survival guides for the socially ambitious. Cards could be folded at the corner to indicate the purpose of your visit. A little bend on the upper right might mean congratulations, while a fold at the lower left could signal condolences. Heaven help you if you forgot which was which, because a wrong fold could turn a wedding celebration into a funereal misunderstanding. And then there were the quirky extremes. Some people commissioned elaborate monograms or even tiny illustrations, flowers, crests, mythical creatures to make their cards stand out. There's even a fringe anecdote about a certain eccentric gentleman who had his calling card printed on thin sheets of chocolate. The servant would take it, the hostess would receive it, and presumably someone would eat it. Probably not the best for longevity, but certainly memorable. You finally hear footsteps returning. The servant reappears with a gracious nod. It's your lucky day. You're ushered into the hall where the scent of beeswax polish and fresh-cut flowers wraps around you. But you notice the silver tray near the door piled with other cards from earlier visitors. You can't help scanning them, wondering who's been here before you. There's a hierarchy at play. You can spot the high-status guests by the quality of their engraving and the weight of the cardstock. Some even have little handwritten notes on the back, a risky move that could be seen as charming or intrusive depending on the recipient's mood. Once inside the drawing room, the hostess greets you with a smile that might be genuine or might be as rehearsed as the rules themselves. You make polite conversation sipping weak tea, but you're acutely aware that this meeting started long before you set foot in the room. The game began the moment you handed over that tiny rectangle. As you leave, the ritual repeats in reverse. The hostess will later decide where your card sits in her mental ledger of social worth. Will she return the visit within the week, signaling mutual respect? Or will she forget, effectively nudging you down the ladder? This is networking Victorian style with all the grace of a ballet and the sharpness of a dueling sword. You tuck your card case back into your pocket, relieved you didn't commit any folding or delivery faux pas. But as you step back into the street, you can't help but wonder how many doors in this city would actually open for you, and how many would be forever closed, no matter how perfect your penmanship. The drizzle hasn't let up, and your damp coat is beginning to feel like a second skin. Still, you press on because your next stop isn't for tea or chit-chat. It's for something far more delicate, paying your respects to the dead. In Victorian England, mourning wasn't just an emotion. It was a full-time dress code with rules so strict they could make a modern HR handbook look casual. You arrive at a shop whose window display is entirely black: dresses, gloves, veils, even parasols. Behind the glass, a headless mannequin stands draped in bombazine, a heavy fabric so somber it seems to swallow light. The door opens with the tinkling of a bell, and the air inside smells faintly of camphor and starch. Here you'll find everything you need to mourn properly, because wearing the wrong shade of black at the wrong time could spark a scandal that lingered longer than the grief itself. Mainstream historical fact: Queen Victoria herself set the gold standard, or perhaps the charcoal standard, for mourning attire when she lost Prince Albert in 1861. She wore black for the remaining 40 years of her life, turning the color into a national symbol of devotion. And when the Queen sets the fashion, you follow, unless you want to look like a heartless monster. But here's the strange part. It wasn't just wear black or don't. There were levels. Full mourning meant solid black from head to toe, often for an entire year. No silk or satin, only matte fabrics like crepe, which had an almost velvety dullness. After that, you could move to half mourning, where you were permitted to wear muted shades like gray lavender or mauve. Historians still argue whether these gradations were truly about expressing grief or simply about keeping the mourning goods industry thriving. And yes, there were quirks. Men had it much easier; they could get away with a black armband. Meanwhile, women faced a tangle of rules about veil length, glove type, and even jewelry. Jet, a fossilized coal-like material, became the go-to adornment, its glossy black surface signaling sorrow without any dangerous sparkle. But one fringe tidbit stands out: some people had their mourning clothes dyed rather than buying new ones, which meant you might be attending a funeral in a dress that had previously been sky blue. If you dared look closely at the seams, you could sometimes see the ghost of its former color. You imagine yourself at a gathering, your crepe dress rustling softly as you move. The veil itches your face, your gloves make it hard to grip a teacup, and the color band makes you long for something bright, anything bright. But even here, in a room full of black-clad figures, the rules are a minefield. Wearing black too briefly suggests you didn't love the deceased enough. Wearing it too long could hint at melodrama or, oddly, a refusal to move on. There's also the silent competition, whose mourning outfit is most in line with the etiquette books, whose veil is just the right length for a widow 6 months in. Its grief turned into a catwalk, and you're expected to glide through it without tripping. Outside the shop, you catch sight of a pale mauve gown in another window, a beacon for those finally allowed into half mourning. You wonder how many women felt relief at reaching that stage, not because the grief had faded, but because they could finally wear something that didn't absorb the summer sun like a portable oven. And when the period ends, Another awkward step returning to colors without seeming too cheerful. Imagine showing up in bright yellow the day after your morning ended. The whispers would be deafening. By the time you leave, clutching your neatly wrapped mourning veil, you realize something unsettling in Victorian England. Even death wasn't an escape from the rules. In fact, it might have been when they tightened the most. Your new mourning veil is tucked away safely, but there's no time to dwell because tonight you've been invited to dine with a family of considerable standing. And if you think eating is simple, you're about to face a gauntlet of rules so elaborate they could make a modern 7-course tasting menu feel like a fast food run. You step into the dining room, a warm haze of candlelight spilling over gleaming silverware and bone china. The table itself looks like a display in a museum, every fork, knife, and spoon perfectly aligned in military precision. Your place setting alone has more cutlery than you've used in the past month. Somewhere in your gut, you suspect you're already holding the wrong fork. Mainstream historical fact: Victorian dining was a theater of manners. The correct fork wasn't just about function. It was a visible sign that you'd been trained in the right kind of home. Guests were expected to follow a choreography of gestures, napkin on lap, at just the right moment, elbows never on the table, no speaking with food in your mouth, and heaven forbid you cut your bread with a knife. Bread must be torn like a holy ritual. And here's the strange part. There were hidden rules. You couldn't begin eating until the hostess lifted her fork, and you had to match her pace throughout the meal. Eating too quickly made you look greedy, too slowly, and you risked holding up the servants who needed to reset the table for the next course. Historians still argue whether these rules kept things orderly or just gave everyone something to silently judge you for. A quirky tidbit: soup was a trap. You had to sip it by moving your spoon away from you, not toward, to avoid splashing. And slurping, no matter how much you loved the broth, was as socially suicidal as opening that umbrella indoors. Oh, and when you were done, you couldn't leave your spoon in the bowl. It had to rest neatly on the underplate. Then there's the meat course. Imagine a perfectly roasted joint placed in front of you. Your instinct is to cut it however you like. But here, you must carve with precision, taking small, delicate bites. And never, never use your knife to gesture while speaking. The only thing worse than that might be the way you handle fish. Yes, fish had its own special knife shaped like a tiny silver shovel, and not using it was the kind of faux pas that could haunt your social calendar for months. One fringe rule you can't believe exists at certain high society dinners: talking across the table was frowned upon. Conversation was meant to flow only to the person on your immediate left or right, changing partners with each course. It turned the meal into a sort of genteel speed dating session, minus the romantic stakes. Usually, as the courses progress, oysters, soup, roast, game, dessert, you're hyper-aware of your posture, your pacing, your hand placement. You even start to notice the subtle glances around the table. Someone raises an eyebrow when a young man uses his bread to mop up gravy. Across the way, a lady's fork slips, clinking loudly against her plate, and the pause in conversation is long enough to make her cheeks burn. By dessert, you're exhausted. The pudding looks heavenly, but your mind is still scanning for traps. Do you use the dessert fork and the spoon? Do you take coffee before or after the ladies retire to the drawing room? You recall reading somewhere that even the way you stir your cup silently without clinking could make or break you. When the meal ends and you rise, you realize you've barely tasted half the food. Every bite was a calculation, every gesture a risk. And yet you've survived without scandal, at least as far as you know. In Victorian England, that's the equivalent of leaving the battlefield without a scratch. You escape the dinner table with your reputation intact, barely. But Victorian society has more traps waiting. Now you're in the parlor, that sacred stage where people gathered after meals to talk play cards or simply sit in silence pretending they were enjoying themselves. And here, posture isn't just a matter of comfort. It's a coded language that tells everyone exactly who you are. The chairs are upholstered in rich damask, the kind that swallows you whole if you relax too much. But relax is the one thing you're not allowed to do. You lower yourself onto the seat like you're made of glass spine, straight shoulders, gently drawn back, chin at a polite angle. Even your knees have a job. They're to remain together, with ankles delicately crossed, unless you want to broadcast that you were raised without the benefit of finishing school. Mainstream historical fact. Victorian etiquette manuals were obsessed with posture, linking it directly to moral character. Slouching suggested laziness, loose morals, or even poor health. A straight back is a straight soul, one guide declared, as if your vertebrae doubled as a moral compass. And since the parlor was where most visitors judged you, every inch of your body was on display, not just your clothing, but how you inhabited it. Here's the strange part. Posture wasn't just about looking refined. It was believed to improve digestion, protect the lungs, and even prevent nervous disorders. Historians still argue whether these health claims were genuinely believed or simply invented to keep people from looking too relaxed in polite company. A quirky tidbit: some women wore posture braces under their gowns, rigid contraptions of whalebone leather or steel to keep them perfectly upright. These devices weren't just uncomfortable, they were borderline medieval. And while men didn't face the same level of scrutiny, a gentleman's gentlemanliness could still be judged by how he held his walking stick, while seated parallel to the legs, tipped down, never sprawled across his lap like a bored schoolboy. The parlor had its own micro-dramas. Maybe someone would sink too far back into the cushions and need an awkward rescue. Maybe a guest would perch so close to the edge of their seat that it looked like they were preparing to bolt. Both extremes carried social messages. The first smacked of carelessness, the second of nervousness or distrust. And you, newcomer to this finely balanced arena, are determined to find the sweet spot, a relaxed alertness that says, I'm perfectly at ease, but I also respect your furniture and your bloodline. Every so often, a servant glides in with a tray of tea, and even the way you reach for your cup is judged. No sprawling elbows, no leaning forward too far, and definitely no clinking of spoon against china. You notice the hostess sitting across from you, her posture like a painting come to life, and you realize she hasn't adjusted her position once in 20 minutes. You start to feel the burn in your back muscles the same way you would during a workout plank, only here the stakes are much higher. There's even a fringe rumor circulating some households arranged their parlor chairs at slightly awkward angles or with subtly uneven seat cushions, forcing guests to adjust constantly. This apparently allowed the hostess to spot who had natural grace and who had to fake it. Whether that's true or just a piece of Victorian gossip, you can't tell. But as your legs start to tingle from the strain of sitting so perfectly, you wouldn't be surprised if it were real. The evening winds down with polite conversation about music, literature, and the weather, all delivered in soft tones. No loud laughter, no sudden movements. The parlor is a theater, and posture is your costume. You rise at the end of the night, without creaking, a small victory glide to the door and step into the cool evening air. Your back aches, your ankles are stiff, and you're oddly relieved to finally slouch. The night air is cool, but instead of heading home, you find yourself drawn to the sound of hoofbeats and the clinking of harness buckles. The gas lamps catch flashes of color. Wait, is that a bonnet on a cat? You're not imagining things. In Victorian England, fashion rules didn't just apply to people. Animals, especially those belonging to the wealthy, were swept up in the same tidal wave of propriety and ornamentation. On the cobblestone street ahead, a horse-drawn carriage rolls past the animals decked in plumed headpieces dyed to match the vehicle's paintwork. Each horse's mane is neatly braided, their tails tied with satin ribbons. It's not just for show, it's a coded message. Well-groomed, fashionably adorned animals told the world their owners had both the means and the refinement to extend elegance beyond their own wardrobes. Mainstream historical fact. In upper-class households, cats, dogs, and even caged birds were often dressed in miniature garments for special occasions. Photographers' studios offered pet portraits where your spaniel might be posed in a tiny velvet cape, or your parrot balanced on a gilded perch draped in lace. But here's the strange part. These weren't always playful indulgences. In certain circles, failing to present your pet according to fashion standards could be seen as neglect, almost as shameful as showing up to dinner in mismatched gloves. Historians still argue whether these customs reflected genuine affection for the animals or were purely about flaunting wealth. A quirky tidbit. Some carriage horses were fitted with ear bonnets, not just to look smart, but to muffle street noise and keep them calm. But for big public events, the bonnets might be made of silk with intricate embroidery. And yes, there are records of cats in knitted sweaters specifically designed to match their owner's own shawl. Imagine knitting two identical outfits just to sit together by the fire. As you stroll past a row of houses, you glimpse a terrier peering out a window, sporting what appears to be a custom-fitted raincoat. Across the street, a milkman's cart clatters by his working horse, unadorned practicality over fashion. The contrast is stark, a reminder that these elaborate rules lived mostly in the realm of those who could afford them. There's even a fringe rumor you overhear from a pair of gossiping ladies. A certain duchess once refused to attend a garden party because her rival arrived with a Pomeranian, wearing a diamond-studded collar identical to her own bracelet. Whether true or not, it speaks volumes about the era's obsession with image, right down to the accessories on four-legged companions. You turn a corner and nearly trip over a cat lounging on the curb. Its head tilts up, revealing a tiny bonnet secured with a ribbon under its chin. The cat doesn't look impressed. It's the expression of someone or something used to being paraded as an extension of its owner's taste. You can't help but wonder how much of the animal's wardrobe is comfort and how much is just compliance with the silent fashion police of the time. By the time you reach the next street, the parade of adorned creatures has faded, replaced by the usual city sights, chimney smoke curling into the night sky, the soft rattle of carriage wheels. But you can't unsee it, pets as living status symbols, their fur just another canvas for Victorian propriety to decorate. The following afternoon, you find yourself near the Thames, drawn by the sound of splashing and laughter. But this isn't some carefree frolic. No, in Victorian England, even public bathing came with a manual's worth of rules. And if you think you can just strip down and dive in, you're about to be fined. Or worse, scandalized. The smell of river water mixes with coal smoke as you approach a wooden bathing station. It's divided into strict sections, one for men, one for women, each shielded from view by tall wooden fences. Modesty is law here, literally. Municipal bylaws governed everything from how much skin you could show to how loudly you were allowed to splash. In some towns, you even needed a ticket from the local authorities to bathe in public waters. Mainstream historical fact. Seaside resorts like Brighton and Margate introduced bathing machines, wooden huts on wheels so bathers could change in private, then be rolled into the water away from prying eyes. For women, this was especially important. Stepping into the surf without the protection of a bathing machine would be considered indecent, even if you were swaddled in a full-body swimsuit. Here's the strange part. Those swimsuits were basically wool dresses, complete with stockings and shoes. Heavy when wet, itchy when dry, and utterly impractical for swimming. But function wasn't the point, propriety was. Historians still argue whether these bathing rules were genuinely about morality or just another way for the wealthy to show they could afford proper seaside holidays. A quirky tidbit. In some areas, men were legally banned from swimming during certain hours, if women were scheduled to bathe, even if the bathing zones were separate. And in at least one documented case, a man was fined for excessive splashing after accidentally soaking a respectable lady's parasol. You watch as a pair of attendants help a lady down the steps of a bathing machine, her voluminous skirt clinging to her legs as the salt water rises. She barely moves her arms, keeping her hat on at all times, as if even the waves need to respect her outfit. Nearby, a group of boys relegated to the men's section practice diving in awkward bursts, mindful of the no rough play notices nailed to the posts. Even river bathing had its own peculiar hazards. The Thames wasn't exactly a pristine playground. Floating debris and questionable currents meant your refreshing dip could turn risky fast. Yet on hot summer days, people still came standing in long queues for their allotted bathing time. Some whispered about daring nighttime swims, but those carried their own dangers: no attendants, no lights, and the ever-present risk of being caught in a place where you weren't supposed to be. As you stroll along the bank, you overhear a pair of older gentlemen reminiscing about the good old days when one could leap off a pier without worrying about fines or bylaws. One chuckles and adds, "Course, that's also how we lost Mr. Henderson's hat, and nearly Mr. Henderson." Before leaving, you pause to watch a bathing machine being pulled ashore, the wheels grinding in the wet sand. Inside, the bather is already changing back into dry clothes, preparing to re-enter society, as though nothing scandalous like touching actual seawater had occurred. You walk away, the echo of the surf behind you, thinking how even something as simple as cooling off on a hot day had to be choreographed in Victorian England. Here, water wasn't just water, it was a stage, and you'd better know your role. You decide to duck into a small neighborhood coffee house, not for coffee as you know it, but for a taste of what the Victorian palate considered a treat. Inside, the air is thick with the smell of roasting beans, damp wool coats, and the faint tang of coal smoke wafting in through the door. Forget your modern idea of a cafe. This place isn't full of hipsters on laptops. It's a hub of debate gossip and sometimes outright bickering. Men in bowler hats lean over newspapers, slapping the table to emphasize a political point. The owner's wife darts between tables, refilling cups and dropping in sugar cubes with the precision of a stage magician. Here's the thing, coffee was still playing second fiddle to tea in Victorian England. Tea had been a cultural mainstay for decades, and coffee houses had to work harder to lure customers. Many offered not just drinks, but penny newspapers, games of chess, and even public lectures. Some were respectable, others less so. Certain coffee houses were thinly veiled meeting spots for radicals, writers, or political dissenters, while others attracted gamblers and petty criminals looking for an easy mark. A historical nugget. Victorian coffee houses were descendants of the 17th and 18th century London coffee culture. But by the mid-1800s, they'd taken on a seedier working-class edge in many areas. Respectable ladies generally wouldn't enter unless accompanied, and in some cities, moralists warned that these places encouraged idleness and low company. The cup placed before you is smaller than you expect, thick porcelain, stained from years of use. The coffee itself is dark, slightly bitter, brewed strong enough to wake a graveyard. If you were hoping for the silky sweetness of a modern cappuccino, prepare for disappointment. Milk is scarce here. Sugar is precious. And yet it's strangely satisfying. The man at the next table leans over and, without asking, begins telling you about the latest railway accident. His accent is broad, his facts possibly dubious, but that's part of the coffee house charm, truth, rumor, and exaggeration swirling together in the steam above your cup. Quirky fact. In some coffee houses, patrons rented cups by the week, leaving them behind on a shelf until their next visit. Your favorite mug might be chipped and mismatched, but it was yours. Others offered bottomless pots for regulars, though that often meant topping up with weaker and weaker brew until the liquid in your cup was more suggestion than coffee. The walls are papered with advertisements, respectable lodgings for gentlemen, lecture on phrenology, cure for indigestion. 2 pence a bottle. A chalkboard near the counter lists the day's specials, though special here means the same 3 items shuffled around: coffee bread and dripping, or if you're lucky, a slab of suet pudding. And yet, for all its rough edges, there's a democratic air to the place. A dock worker can sit beside a clerk, a journalist beside a petty thief, and for the price of a cup, they're equals, at least until the caffeine wears off. As you finish your drink, the door swings open, letting in a gust of cold, damp air and a man selling pamphlets. The room's attention shifts immediately. There's news from the continent, rumors of strikes and talk of a new play scandalizing polite society. You realize that for the Victorians, coffee houses weren't just about drinking coffee. They were about drinking in the world. Stepping outside, you can still hear the hum of conversation behind you. For a moment, you think about staying, ordering another cup, and letting the hours pass in debate and storytelling. But the city calls, and there are more peculiar customs to discover. Your feet take you to a narrow lane that smells faintly of yeast and wood smoke, and soon you're standing before a Victorian bakery. The window display is a humble affair. No pastel frosted cupcakes or glossy pastries here. Instead, loaves of dense brown bread, hearty meat pies, and currant buns are stacked like little fortresses behind the glass. The warmth hits you first when you step inside. It's almost intoxicating after the damp chill outside. The air is heavy with the scent of fresh bred yeast flour and the faintly sweet note of treacle. Behind the counter, a flour-dusted baker is pulling a tray of cottage loaves from a massive brick oven, their crusts crackling as they cool. Victorian bakeries were more than shops. They were lifelines. For working-class families without ovens at home, the local bakehouse was where you could bring your own dough shaped and ready to be baked for a small fee. On Sundays, families often brought their meat joints or puddings to the bakery ovens while the bread baked. The oven's heat, after all, was far more reliable than a temperamental home grate. A historical detail you might not expect: bread was often sold by weight, not loaf size, to keep prices fair when doughs varied in water content. But not all bakers were honest. Some were caught lightening bread with alum or chalk to save on flour costs, practices that could make you quite ill. The 1860s Adulteration Acts tried to curb such frauds, but for poorer districts, questionable bread remained a fact of life. The baker offers you a currant bun still warm. It's dense, chewy, studded with a modest handful of dried fruit. Sugar is expensive, so the sweetness is subtle, just enough to keep you nibbling. The Victorians loved spiced buns, especially on holidays, but day-to-day bread was plain, hearty fuel for hard labor. In the corner, a young maid in a drab dress is paying for a family's daily loaf, clutching the coins as though they might disappear. The baker wraps her bread in a scrap of paper, old newspaper, judging by the faint ink smudge, and sends her off with a nod. Quirky fact: some bakers also acted as neighborhood news carriers. While kneading dough, they'd pass on gossip overheard from dozens of customers. You could learn about everything from a neighbor's new baby to the latest crime wave before you'd even paid for your bread. A boy bursts in carrying a small ceramic pot. He's here for the bakery's other staple, hot pies. These aren't the delicate pies you'd see in a patisserie today, but hefty, peppery affairs crammed with minced meat or leftover cuts designed to keep a laborer going until nightfall. You try one and understand instantly why these were so beloved, filling, portable, and perfect for eating on the go in a bustling industrial city. Behind the counter shelves are stacked with tins of gingerbread and treacle biscuits for the better-off customers. There's a certain pride in the presentation. Gingerbread men with currant eyes, their slightly sinister smiles daring you to bite their heads off. When you leave, the baker calls after you, offering a farewell that sounds like both a blessing and a warning. Mind the mud and keep your bread dry. Out on the street again, the loaf you've bought is tucked under your arm, radiating warmth into your side. And as you bite into that still warm crust, you realize that in Victorian London, food wasn't just about taste. It was about survival, community, and the comforting certainty that tomorrow's loaf would be waiting. You wander away from the bakery, nibbling at the crust, when a faint metallic clang draws your attention. Turning down a narrower street, you find yourself before the yawning doors of a Victorian blacksmith's forge. The air here is thicker, hotter, and smells of iron and coal. Inside, the rhythmic clang, clang, clang of hammer on anvil echoes like a heartbeat through the dim space. A muscular man in a leather apron is bent over his work forearms, slick with sweat despite the winter chill outside. The forge glows a fierce orange heat, radiating in waves that sting your cheeks. Sparks leap and scatter like fireflies each time his hammer strikes the glowing metal. Victorian blacksmiths weren't just makers of horseshoes, though that was steady work. They fashioned tools, repaired farm equipment, made rail spikes for the ever-expanding railway, and even forged ornamental gates for the homes of the wealthy. In the city, the clanging workshop was a place where practical necessity met artistry. A fascinating detail: the blacksmith's skill could mean the difference between life and death. A poorly forged horseshoe could lame a horse, an accident that might ruin a cab driver's livelihood. Faulty rail spikes or tools could cause industrial accidents, which were tragically common in the era. The blacksmith's reputation was everything. The smith notices you watching, and with a grin beckons you closer. He picks up a long iron bar already glowing red at one end and gestures for you to stand back as he plunges it into the coals. The sound of the bellows is a deep sigh feeding oxygen into the fire, making it roar brighter. In the forge's corner, a teenage apprentice is grinding the edge of a scythe, sending a fan of bright sparks onto the packed dirt floor. Apprenticeships in trades like this often began as young as 12. The hours were long, the work backbreaking, but the reward was a respected skill, and perhaps one day a shop of your own. The smith hands you the small iron nail still warm from his tongs. It's surprisingly heavy for its size, a reminder that in a world before mass production truly took hold, every tiny piece of metal had to be made by hand. You imagine a whole crate of these nails being hammered out one by one each, the product of skill, muscle, and fire. While the forge roars, the smith tells you how the industry is changing. Cheap factory-made goods are beginning to undercut traditional craftsmen. Some blacksmiths are adapting, repairing, rather than making, or specializing in custom work for the wealthy. Others are closing up shop, replaced by machines that can do in minutes what once took a man hours. There's a note of both pride and resignation in his voice. He pauses to take a swig from a tin mug, tea gone lukewarm in the heat, and then returns to his work, shaping a new hinge for a heavy wooden gate. The precision is hypnotic. Tap, tap, turn, tap, tap, turn. The sound feels timeless, as though it could have echoed the same way 200 years before, or 200 years from now. A random quirk of the trade, blacksmiths often became informal dentists in rural areas. With their tools' strength and resistance to squeamishness, they were sometimes asked to extract a bad tooth when no doctor was nearby. The idea makes you wince. When you step back into the street, blinking against the pale daylight, after the forge's firelight, you feel as though you've stepped out of another world entirely. The ringing in your ears slowly fades, but you can still smell the coal smoke clinging to your clothes. You tuck the warm nail into your pocket, a small weighty token of a craft built on fire sweat, and the stubborn refusal to let machines take all the glory. The narrow street curves and opens into a wide cobblestone square, bustling with energy. Vendors' cries overlap in a messy chorus: fresh oysters, sweet apples, newspapers, just a penny while carts rattle over the uneven stones. In the middle of the square stands something that looks wildly out of place, a glass and iron structure gleaming in the winter sunlight. It's one of the new Victorian glass arcades, a marvel of industrial engineering, and a symbol of the era's obsession with progress. Inside, sheltered from the soot and drizzle, rows of tiny shops line a covered walkway selling everything from silk gloves to mechanical pocket watches. The air smells faintly of polish and perfume, a rare treat compared to the coal and horse stink outside. A porter in a neat uniform tips his cap as you step inside. The arcade's roof arches high above, supported by slender iron columns painted green. Sunlight streams through the glass panes overhead, transforming the whole place into a bright, indoor boulevard. It's no wonder the wealthy adore these spaces. Shopping without getting your boots muddy feels downright revolutionary. At one end, a watchmaker leans over his bench, a jeweler's loop fixed to his eye. His hands move in delicate, precise motions, coaxing life into a miniature machine of brass gears and steel springs. The pocket watch, he explains proudly, will keep perfect time for decades if cared for. But such a treasure is far beyond the means of the average laborer. Most still rely on the chimes of church bells or factory whistles. You wander further and find a print seller displaying lithographs of exotic places. Egyptian temples, Indian palaces, even the Australian outback. The Victorians are obsessed with exploration thanks to the British Empire's global reach. A clerk eagerly explains that these images are made possible by new printing technology, which allows faster and cheaper reproductions. For many, these prints are the only way they'll ever see the world beyond Britain's shores. Near the center of the arcade is a small tea room, all white tablecloths and polished silver. Ladies in feathered hats sip tea with gloved hands, chatting in low voices. A pianist plays softly in the corner. Even the pastries here seem engineered for beauty, tiny towers of sponge and cream topped with candied violets. You hesitate before ordering a cup of strong Assam tea, aware that this indulgence would cost a factory girl half a day's wages. A subtle undercurrent runs through the place. The display of wealth is as important as the goods themselves. The glass arcade isn't just for buying, it's for being seen. Fashionable couples stroll slowly, pausing to admire shop windows, their eyes occasionally flicking sideways to note who else is watching. You overhear a conversation at a glove counter, two men debating the future of trade. One predicts a world where goods arrive from halfway across the globe in mere weeks, perhaps even days. The other scoffs at the notion, convinced the pace of ships cannot be improved much more. You smile inwardly, knowing they are standing on the cusp of unimaginable changes. As you leave the arcade, a sudden gust of cold air reminds you that outside the city remains as grimy and unpredictable as ever. But for a brief moment you've stood inside a vision of the future, bright ordered and shining with the promise of industry's wonders. In your pocket, the warm nail from the blacksmith now rests alongside a small paper bag from the print shop, inside a colored lithograph of the Crystal Palace folded carefully to avoid creases. A keepsake of the Victorian dream wrapped in glass and steel. The arcade's warmth fades behind you, replaced by the sharp bite of coal smoke and the distant clang of iron. Following the sound, you weave through the streets until a great iron and glass roof looms ahead, arched high like the ribs of a whale rimmed with soot. The railway station. It's as if the whole city funnels into this place. Cabs rattle up, horses snorting in the cold, their drivers calling out destinations. Porters in waistcoats and caps haul stacks of leather trunks, their boots slipping on patches of frozen slush. Underfoot, the ground is a mix of black ice ash and trampled straw. The air is alive with the hiss of steam and the metallic screech of wheels on rails. Stepping inside, you're engulfed in a foggy haze, the station's breath. Warm vapor gushes from the pistons of a waiting locomotive curling into the rafters. Gas lamps flicker overhead, their glow struggling against the drifting steam. Somewhere a brass bell clangs twice and a whistle cuts through the din like a blade. The concourse is a scene of controlled chaos. Families embrace in tearful farewells. Businessmen in bowler hats stride briskly, newspapers tucked under their arms. A soldier in a red tunic leans casually against a pillar. Boots polished to a mirror shine the brass buttons of his coat, gleaming in the lamplight. You pause at the ticket counter, where clerks in stiff collars work at a furious pace, sliding paper tickets across the polished wood. Above them, an enormous board lists destinations in neat black letters: Manchester, Bristol, Edinburgh, even Paris via the steam packet ferry. The future of travel is right here. What once took days by coach now takes mere hours by train. At the platform, a hulking locomotive rests like a sleeping beast. Its boilerplates are warm to the touch, damp with condensation. The fireman swings open the furnace door, and for a moment the platform is bathed in the fierce orange light of the coal fire inside. Sparks leap into the air, drifting away like tiny shooting stars. The smell is intoxicating, hot iron-scorched oil and burning anthracite. Passengers bustle into carriages, some polished and plush for the wealthy, with velvet seats and private compartments. Others bare and drafty for the working class, little more than wooden benches. Through a window, you spot a woman cradling a wicker basket in which a pair of curious kittens peek out, eyes wide at the commotion. A guard's voice booms over the noise. All aboard for York, Durham, and Newcastle. He swings a green flag, and with a shuddering lurch, the train begins to move. Steel wheels grip the rails, pushing against the weight of the world. The platform vibrates as the great machine exhales steam in rhythmic bursts, chuff, 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 gaining speed until it slips into the fog beyond the station. A boy runs up beside you, selling hot meat pies from a tin-lined box strapped around his neck. The aroma is irresistible, rich with pepper and gravy. You hand over a coin and bite into the crust. It burns your tongue, but you don't care. Hunger trumps caution. Somewhere overhead, a clock chimes the hour. You glance around, noticing a group of ragged children clustered near a bench, their bare feet blue with cold. They're not traveling anywhere. They're here for the warmth, the scraps, and perhaps the slim hope of work, carrying luggage for a passenger, too hurried to notice their small hands. As you step back toward the station's grand entrance, a new train pulls in with a screech of brakes. Its windows are fogged from within, and as the doors open, the crowd swells forward, friends reunited, strangers brushing past, the noise swelling into something like the pulse of the century. Outside, the world is darker now, the street lamps casting halos through the drifting soot. The railway station fades behind you, but its rhythm lingers in your bones, a steady, unstoppable beat, the sound of an age in motion. In Victorian households, the hierarchy wasn't just a matter of who wore the fancier clothes or who got the bigger bedroom. It extended right down to who was allowed to open their mouth. For servants, speaking was a privilege, not a right, and one that came with a minefield of etiquette. The golden rule: never speak unless spoken to. A butler might stand at his post for hours, a silent shadow in the corner, until the master of the house addressed him. Even then, the reply had to be as short and deferential as possible, never more than the question required. Any extra detail was considered presumptuous, and heaven forbid you cracked a joke. There was even a term for when servants overstepped impertinence. This didn't mean rudeness in the modern sense. It could be something as mild as a housemaid offering an opinion on the weather if she hadn't been asked. Here are a few of the unspoken speech laws of the Victorian servant world. Don't initiate conversation. You might overhear the most tantalizing gossip while clearing the drawing room, but to mention it even casually was to risk instant dismissal. Stick to yes, sir, or no, ma'am. Any elaboration beyond confirming or denying was walking on thin ice. Address by title, never name. Calling your employer Mr. Harcourt was proper. Calling him Henry was social suicide. Silence is loyalty. Discretion was the ultimate virtue. Speaking about family affairs outside the house, even to another servant, was a firing offense. And it wasn't just what you said, it was how you said it. Servants were expected to use a tone that was calm, low, and almost self-erasing. Your voice was there to serve the master's needs, not your own expression. The butler's baritone should be smooth as polished mahogany, the maid's tone gentle like lace. In the grandest houses, there were even designated conversational zones. You could speak in the kitchen, the servants' hall, or the laundry room, But in the dining room during service, your tongue was to stay as still as the silver you were polishing. One slip, one ill-timed comment, and you might find yourself turned off without a character. Victorian code for being fired without a reference. In an age when references were your lifeline to another job, this was effectively professional exile. The irony. While servants were forbidden from speaking freely, they often knew everything. They were the silent witnesses to every family quarrel, whispered confession, and secret romance. And that meant the ones who mastered the art of saying nothing were the most powerful of all, because their silence was worth more than gold. In the Victorian world, dining was never just about eating. It was a performance. The table was a miniature battlefield of status, taste, and refinement, and every movement you made was judged like an Olympic sport. One false step, and you could tumble from respectable society faster than a bad soufflé. The fork fiasco. For starters, there was the infamous fork hierarchy. The Victorians loved courses, sometimes a dozen or more, and each one came with its own specific implement. Oyster fork, fish fork, entree fork, dessert fork. Heaven help you if you grabbed the wrong one. The correct method was to work from the outside in, but in the candle-lit glow of a crowded table, it was easy to mistake the salad fork for the fish fork. Make that blunder, and the hostess might raise an eyebrow, silently branding you as not quite the thing. Soup was another minefield. You must never blow on it to cool it, only a savage would do such a thing. You were to spoon it away from yourself, not toward, and you should never, never slurp. Slurping was considered so grotesque that it could doom an entire marriage prospect. The napkin code. The napkin was more than a scrap of linen. It was a secret signal, placed neatly on your lap as soon as you sat. It stayed there until the hostess rose. Lay it on your chair if you stepped away mid-meal. Fold it loosely, never precisely when you were finished. Folding it tightly suggested you were dissatisfied with the meal, which could insult your host. Bread and butter. Politics. Bread was not to be bitten directly, always tear off small pieces, buttering each morsel individually. And remember, the butter knife was for communal butter, never for eating. Using your table knife to reach into the shared dish was an unforgivable breach. Conversation traps. Polite dinner talk avoided anything too personal, too political, or too dull. You could discuss the weather, the opera, or a recent trip to Bath, but steer clear of illness money and, most dangerous of all, religion. The Victorians had an art for talking for hours without saying anything controversial at all. Timing is everything. You did not begin eating until the hostess lifted her fork. You stopped eating when she stopped, no matter how much of your food remained. And under no circumstances did you finish before she did. It would look as though you were rushing her along, or worse, that you were greedy. One wrong move at the Victorian dinner table could cost you far more than embarrassment. It could cost you your social standing, your future invitations, even a valuable marriage connection. In short, it wasn't the food that was dangerous in Victorian dining rooms, it was the fork. In the Victorian age, a calling card was not simply a piece of cardboard with your name on it. It was your social fingerprint, your miniature self, your passport to acceptance or rejection. A poorly chosen one could open no doors, and worse, it could slam them shut forever. The card, as a silent messenger. These cards were exchanged during visits left at households or presented at gatherings. They carried no more than your name, perhaps an address, and maybe a tasteful monogram. But their power was immense. Before you uttered a single word, your card spoke for you. And in the language of Victorian society, it could whisper respectable and refined, or scream vulgar upstart. Paper, ink, and peril. Paper quality was paramount. Too thin and it looked cheap. Too thick and you appeared ostentatious. The ink mattered too black was traditional for men, dark brown or muted gray for ladies. Anything flashy, scarlet, emerald, or heaven forbid gold was a declaration that you were either dangerously eccentric or socially clueless. So the font of fortune, or ruined typefaces, carried hidden messages. An understated serif suggested elegance. Overly ornate scripts hinted at pretension or affectation. And beware of clutter, a crowded card marked you as trying too hard, as though you were shoving your resume into polite society's face. Size and shape. Men's cards were typically smaller and simpler. Ladies' cards were slightly larger with delicate embellishments. Round edges could be chic, but only if subtly done. Oversized cards, though, were an unspoken horror. They implied you thought your importance required more space. The ritual of presentation. Handing over a calling card was an art. You did not fling it onto a tray like a tavern bill. You placed it face up with your name oriented toward the recipient. Folded corners had meaning. Turning down the upper right corner indicated a personal visit. The lower left, congratulations. The upper left, condolences. Misfold one and you could be offering sympathy to someone just married, or congratulations to a widow. Timing and tact cards were not left at random. They were delivered during calling hours in the late afternoon, often by carriage, sometimes without the intention of entering the house. Leave a card at the wrong time or to the wrong person, and your name might end up in the social equivalent of a blacklist. A calling card could be your golden key or a silent saboteur. In the stratified world of Victorian society, an inch of paper could determine whether your name was engraved on an invitation to the season's grandest ball or forgotten entirely.